Um, my hope for tonight is very simple, actually. It's twofold. I want you just to consider a shift in your paradigm. Number one, I'm presenting an idea that I'm passionate about, that I've kind of lived out myself, but it's just an invitation to consider a shift in your paradigm. I'm not telling you that you're doing church wrong or that I figured it out or I've got all the answers. It's just a conversation around considering a shift in your paradigm. The second thing I'm hoping to do is that you are invited into a conversation with each other. Now that's on purpose. I was actually on the Next Gen. I'm on the Next Gen team with the denomination, and I was on the EMC Connected team for a while. And the whole point of the EMC family, if you're not familiar with kind of our tribe, is kind of content and the swash of conversation. And so we're really hoping that you, even though it's awkward and it's going to be kind of an experiment in a sense, to just throw yourselves into conversation in our huddles. There's not actually a lot of time to have conversation together, but it's really, really important. So I want to invite you to consider a shift in your paradigm and have a conversation with each other about it. That's really my only goal tonight. Now, there's going to be some barriers to the success of my goal, of my hope for this evening. And I've kind of categorized them in 4 ways. I'm going to be using the word child a lot. Kids, childhood, children. And there's an inconvenience of childhood. That's barrier number 1. You might feel like it's rubbing you the wrong way because you're gonna get this image of smelly, dirty, messy, loud, obnoxious kids. I have 3 of those, so I know what those visceral feelings feel like. That kids are just plain annoying, and that might be a barrier for you to understand and kind of take this shift with me in the paradigm. The second is actually about you. It's the inconveniencing of adulting. So our adult minds that require structure and rigidity and security, and consistency and are averse to change or perceived chaos, that might be a barrier to helping that my hope and my goal be satisfied tonight in a shift in paradigm. The third is the inconvenience of family. I'm going to be using the word family a lot. Now, this is absolutely a trigger word, and it's a buzzword, especially in church circles. All through my ministry life, the word family is kind of something that we have avoided. And I'm actually trying to recapture the word family. And I don't mean it in terms of nuclear family. So you may have, a lot of us have really dysfunctional, messy, hurtful, painful family experiences. And the word family may actually be a trigger, and it may be a barrier for you. And it is not my intention to invalidate your feelings, your perspective on family. It's my hope to recapture and kind of resalvage what I think family is actually all about. And the fourth, and maybe the most poignant barrier, is actually the inconvenience of Amos. I can speak in riddles, and I can get lost in my own head, and I can stumble over stuff. So if you have questions, please answer them so that I can be more clear in my presentation. I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm not trying to aggravate you. It's just me. So there's a fifth kind of barrier, and it's actually really personal to me. And it's more of a confession of where I'm at personally. I'm only 4 weeks out of a job in a church that I was a part of for 9.5 years. And I'm actually mentally, physically, and emotionally in what I think counselors call deep grief. And in some senses, I probably shouldn't even be doing this because I feel really, really raw and vulnerable. But the irony of what I'm presenting tonight is actually a manifestation of the values that I hold, that I'm grieving the loss of my family in my church. And so it's kind of hitting home for me tonight as well. So that's my hope for you tonight. If, as Krista said, if you have questions, please write them down and share them in the chat, and that would be great. We'll actually have a time, if we have time at the end, for a question and answer time at the end. I'd love to answer your questions as best as possible. First, what I want us to do is just pause, reflect, and imagine. I just want you to just pause the mind, what's going on around you, the space that you're in. I just want you to just imagine a blank space. And then I want you to imagine a world, and a world that you're occupying, that you're in, that you're walking in. And I want you to imagine that you can see the sun and it's setting. And before you in the distance is a tall, dark, mysterious woods. Now the woods are warmly dark. They're not scary dark. They're inviting you. You can feel them kind of calling out to you. And as you kind of walk closer to them, you can see them. They're lit with golden lamps and torches and fireflies. In the distance, you can hear the murmur of joyful conversation coming out of those woods. And then there's an eruption of laughter and clinking of plates. And as you walk towards the wood closer and closer and closer, following this well-worn path of grass, you see that there's a clearing. And in the middle of the clearing is a large, ancient table surrounded by large, ancient trees. And ornate, beautiful crystal chandeliers are kind of hanging off the boughs and branches of these trees, spreading light over this enormous table. And as you look across the enormous table, you see it is adorned with a spread of food and color and drink and merriment. The smells are rich and full, and you've walked into a feast. My question for you tonight: what kind of church do you want to be a part of? Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for this time. I thank you for this space. I thank you that you are here, even in the digital sphere, that you're with us now, that you're with me now. I thank you that you invite us into family, that we get to be co-heirs with you. And that I thank you for my brothers and sisters that are across the country right now. And I pray that you would guide the conversation and you would help me stumble through it. In your name, for your sake. Amen. I want us to start really quickly identifying kind of the foundation of what I think is kind of the problem, in a sense. And it's that we are creatures of space and time. Unlike what Yoda says, we are not luminous beings. We are grounded, holistic beings in space and time. And we occupy space physically, and we occupy space socially. And if we think of our physical space, I remember early COVID, maybe you have a similar experience to this. If we're kind of narrowing in on the church, we're going to focus on the church, the physical space of the church. I remember thinking when COVID hit, really early on, actually, probably a couple weeks in, and it's no offense to my church, my congregation, but just how useless the building was. This enormous, like 20,000 square foot building, maybe it's more, I don't even know, just sat empty. And all these halls and classrooms and nooks and crannies and sanctuary, it just was empty and vacuous. And then a second realization that this space that we have was not designed for COVID life. We didn't have a studio space. We didn't have really consistent internet. We didn't have a booth for live streaming or a sound stage to do like live streaming stuff on Sunday mornings. We were not at all prepared in our physical space for COVID. Now, you might be saying, well, obviously, Amos, like, why am I here if you're just telling me the most obvious thing in the world? Well, it's actually, I think it's a little more profound than that, because the space wasn't designed for that, because there wasn't any value in it. And I realized as the physical space didn't meet the needs, it's actually not the design of the space itself, it's the values that pushed the design that came first. Our physical spaces flows out from our values. And you can see that in our church. If I were to kind of break down Hanover Missionary Church, which is the one I used to work at, I actually, to be honest, found it quite disjointed. And you can kind of see the history of the church as it grew and evolved, and the initial sanctuary grew to a larger sanctuary, it grew to a gymnasium. And you can see kind of the manifestations of the values of the congregation as it shifted, but they didn't actually dovetail together very well. There wasn't a great physical flow between the spaces, because the values in the initial stage weren't there, and the values changed, and the physical design met up and were pushed from the values. So values actually comes first. Design comes second. Outcomes follow. So I'm sitting here in this classroom trying to film my Crafty Time videos for my SummerSlam, and it's basically a prison cell. It's a 12 by 8 prison block wall. The acoustics are awful. It's not a studio at all. Of course it's not. Never did we value kind of the digisphere back when the building was designed. And so there's kind of a problem with that, is that we actually inherit the spaces that we occupy. We inherit the designs, and kind of the values of those who've gone before us in the spaces that we occupy. And that's not always a bad thing. It's good that we don't have to rebuild the church every single week on a new set of values. But we can inherit it and we can forget about it and we can take it for granted. So if you think of physical space, we're also social beings and we have social spaces. The same thing that happens with physical space happens socially. Now, this is where it gets a little more complicated, a little more nuanced, a little harder to grasp, but the same kind of rubric can be applied, that values drives design, which derives outcome. So the social, if you're thinking social spaces, to kind of bring it home, we think naturally the first kind of social space that we occupy would be our nuclear family. No matter how it looks or how functional it is, we are all birthed into a family of some sort. So our first social space is our family. Then we have our kind of our friend systems and our networks, our systems, and then we've kind of landed in the church. We have governance structures, and then how we staff, how we volunteer, how we treat our volunteers, how we handle our populations, who we're targeting, and how the different stages that we're kind of trying to kind of build and design for. And those social spaces and design produce outcomes. So your staffing in your church, your role in your church is derived from a design. It was designed somewhere. And if the logic flows, the design is actually coming from a set of values. Now, this is where the conversation gets a little more challenging, and oftentimes it can feel personal and it can feel difficult, and we actually don't know. I think this is what happens when churches try to, quote unquote, revision. Our church tried to do this about 5 years ago, and it was a really, really challenging exercise to really get at the bedrock of values from our congregation. It's a really hard task to do. And if you're a pastor or a practitioner in the church, you probably know what I'm talking about. But those values that are shared inform the spaces that we create, which produce outcomes. Now, my experience in COVID was that, one, we never designed for COVID life. And two, it became really clearly obvious and really quick that the outcomes weren't matching up with my set of values, the values that I think the church really should, really should be going after. And so, in summary, before we kind of move on in conversation, our physical and social spaces have been designed from a set of values. In order to change the outcome, we need to adjust the design, which may mean we need to reflect and adjust the values driving the design. Now, in a moment, I'm going to offer an invitation to consider a new paradigm of a new set of values that may inform our design, that may change the outcome of our gatherings. But right now, we're actually going to do our first social experiment, which is our first breakout session. Now, some of you may absolutely hate this. The thought of talking to a bunch of strangers terrifies you. Some are going to thrive in this setting. It's on purpose, and I'm just inviting you to go along with it and trust the community to kind of grab you on either end of it. So I'm going to hand it off to Krista, and she's going to give you some further instructions.
Thank you, Amos. I think you demonstrated already how creative and intellectual you are in bringing us into this conversation. We're going to go into a 15-minute breakout room right now. All you're going to have to do is accept the invitation into that room in just a moment, and then you're going to unmute yourself. We don't have designated leaders in those rooms. So if maybe the most extroverted person can rise up and take charge of that room, just to make sure everybody has an opportunity to share if they choose to. It is okay not to talk in these rooms. It is okay to be an observer. But if you have something you want to contribute to the conversation, please do share. I'm also going to ask for one other person to volunteer in that room, and that is some kind of secretary. We don't want a lot of notes, but if there's some really profound thoughts that you feel would be helpful to the conversation, can you just write those down? And I'm also going to ask whoever that person is to stay on the call for just about 5 to 10 minutes after with us and share those thoughts with us. That's after the 90-minute call together. So we are going to send you into some rooms to do all of that. And there are some questions in the chat right now. So if you click on the chat, it's going to say it has 2 questions there. Before you attack those questions together, take a couple of minutes and just introduce yourselves to each other, who you are, where you're from, and why you chose to join this call today. All right, Joel, send us to our rooms.
Welcome back. So my sister, oh yeah, got some Narnia talk there. My little sister's on this call, and she says she hates Zoom huddles. So if you're with my little sister, you need to really give her a hard time, because I love her so much. So what I want to do next is again just shift our perspective a little bit and actually visit probably my favorite story in the entire scriptures, and it's coming from probably maybe competing with John, my favorite gospel, my favorite book of the Bible, from Mark 10. And so what I want you to do is just sit back and reflect and go back to that space of imagining and just be present in the story. And in order to do that, I want you to imagine that you're in an ancient village, and you're an ancient Jew, a part of an ancient village. You have a job, you have a family, you have purpose, you know the scriptures, you know Torah, you've been brought up in this ancient tradition that goes back all the way to Abraham and beyond. And then you hear that Jesus of Nazareth had come to town. Now, you probably haven't seen Jesus before, but you know of Jesus. You've heard a lot about him. This is quite a long time into Jesus' public ministry. You know that the rumors have just spread that John the Baptist, his cousin, was just killed by Herod not too long ago. And you've heard about this amazing human being, these incredible miracles, these mighty acts of deeds, and his intentions and his purposes and his mission on earth is being circled around. And so you cannot help but travel to find where Jesus is. Your curiosity overtakes you. As you drop what you're doing, maybe you kind of leave your kids aside or whatever, you say goodbye to your spouse, and you make your way to the public space where Jesus was. But you weren't the first to arrive. No, Jesus is a very popular person at this point. Many people were already there, and a crowd was encircling him, but kind of keeping a distance from him so that they can still hear him and interact with him, because he's actually speaking. And there's kind of a dull kind of murmur in this crowd, and like an electricity in the air that Jesus has actually come to your town. And you notice that there's men surrounding Jesus, and by the way they're kind of puffing their chests and kind of keeping their chins up with these prideful looks in their eyes, you can assume that they are his chosen 12, his guardians at this point. And you're right to know that they're his disciples. And as you listen intently, you hear Jesus speak so eloquently, so confidently, so passionately, so carefully and creatively. It becomes obvious you've never seen or heard a person like this before. He is truly a remarkable person. And you are enraptured in this spirit experience. When suddenly you hear it, the obnoxious, loud, yammering chatter of children. And you see through the shoulders of those in front of you that this horde of kids is moving towards Jesus, and your heart kind of races because you don't see the parents stopping them. And they're moving close to Jesus, and they're getting closer and closer and closer. And then you see actually there are actually mothers there with these kids, and they're actually holding infants, and they're moving, pushing through the crowd, making their way to Jesus. And finally the children rush towards him, and they start climbing on his legs and tugging at his robe, and he stops and he picks them up and he looks at the mothers. And then the disciples, these guardians, these men, stunned that they had failed to stop these kids from encroaching on their job, grabbed the shoulders of the children and started pushing them off and shooing them away, and abruptly and sharply telling them to leave, and motioned for the mothers to scram and be gone. How dare you interrupt the master? How dare you You kids make so much noise. How dare you stop ministry? How dare you interrupt the work of God? And then Jesus, a look of fury. These are my words. This is coming from Mark. Irate, Jesus turns his face to his disciples and says, don't push these children away. Don't ever get between me and them. These children are at the very center of life in the kingdom. And mark this, Jesus says, unless you, he's talking to his disciples, his closest 12, unless you accept God's kingdom in the simplicity of a child, you'll never get in. Then he turns back, he gathers the children in his arms, he lays hands on them, and he blesses them. Don't ever get between me and these children. The ESV says it this way: the kingdom belongs to children. And you cannot enter the kingdom unless you become like a child. And what I want to introduce to you through this story, now this story admittedly is one of my favorites in the entire Bible. And I believe it's actually the most under-theologized, under-learned, underdeveloped, under-appreciated portions of the entire scriptures. And I would stake my entire reputation on that, whatever that even means. That this small story has actually shaped my entire 15 years in ministry. The kingdom belongs to children, and if we don't become like children, we won't enter it. Now, the context of this story is actually remarkable because in the ancient times, though the Jews appreciated children and childhood, they really saw them as kind of a means to an end, an heir to their kind of to their family. They weren't appreciated the way we would maybe appreciate children today. And certainly in the Greco-Roman world, children were almost seen as chattel. They didn't have high-ranking status in the community. So the fact that Mark takes his time, wastes his precious scroll, which we have to think about that, the resources, the scarcity of resources in those days, to actually write this into his gospel, meant that it meant something deeply to him, that it profoundly shaped him. But the problem is that Mark himself was an adult. And so the appreciation of this text, of this story, is appreciated by adults. What else did Jesus say about childhood and children and interacting with children in the kingdom? We actually don't really know. Luke mentions it, but he's basically copying off of Mark. So we really don't know what else Jesus says about children. So there's a lot of debate about this text, in commentaries. And I'll be honest, I find most of them wholly unsatisfactory. That's my caveat. It's hard to interact with this passage because we are coming at it through the lens of adulting, adults, the inconvenience of being an adult. We literally can't become children again. So what is Jesus actually saying? So lots of folks, lots of scholars say it's to have like a kind of a simple faith like a child, like a simple trust in God the Father that's kind of unquestioning and kind of goes along with the flow, like some kind of a simple-minded and placid, and there's a lot of debate, and I can't get into it. But generally, I think we've missed the mark. That's not what Jesus is saying. And so my invitation, my hope tonight was to invite a conversation around a paradigm shift. And here's the first invitation. I think what Jesus is actually saying, something a little more profound. I think he's saying we're not to become like children in terms of our kiddishness. We're not to become physical children. No, we're to take on the posture of childlikeness, which is imaginative through imagination, through play, and through story. So consider the following. I think there's three folds that are going on in this story. There's a threefold thing that Jesus is trying to say. And the first is that you have to enter as a child. Now, imagination is the language of children. If you ever watch kids, if you've been around kids, they are creatures of imagination. They see what isn't there. They imagine and the impossible being possible, and they seamlessly weave in and out of this world of wonder and curiosity and imagination and kind of the impossible being made possible. And their imagination is actually worked out in their play. It becomes their work. So what they've imagined, what they're kind of constructing in their mind, what they're experimenting, their curiosities are worked out playfully. And so they experiment, they smash things, they make up games, they test the limits of their imagination through their play. And it's spontaneous and it's joyful and it's for its own sake. They're not playing to achieve. They're not playing to hit benchmarks. They're not playing to get gains. They're playing because it's fun. And their play is the outer working of that curiosity and that imagination. But their play isn't just necessarily playful. It's embedded in story. And it's really hard to distinguish a child's imagination being worked out in play that isn't somehow connected to story. A beginning, a middle, an end, a purpose, a flow. If we're thinking story, we're thinking that there's roles and an identity and purpose and meaning to the thing that we're doing. And if you've ever watched a group of kids play, they do this absolutely brilliantly and seamlessly. That children imagine worlds, they play them, they co-create universes, and then they embed themselves into the story of the universe that they're making up on the spot. And in those universes that they're co-creating together, they are making up new rules. They are making up laws of physics. They are co-sharing this creative process of how the rules even exist for their play. It is absolutely brilliant. And kids do this without thinking. I watch my own children do this every single day without question. It's seamless. They're in and out of these worlds, and it's breathless for them. I think as adults, we have forgotten what that's like. And actually to enter into their play, it takes work. And so I think what Jesus is saying in this first consideration is to be like a child is to be curiously imaginative, kind of a fear and a mystery of God, of wonder and questing, of the invisible and the miraculous and the impossible made possible, the invisible being made visible, exploring the unknown wonder and meaning of life in their God questing in his spirit. And in that curiously imaginative posture, we work it out playfully, spontaneously, for its own sake, not for achievement, not for benchmarks, not for goals, but out of an act of joyful creation. And when we do, we become co-creators with the Spirit, and we become co-creators with others. We become co-collaborators with others. And when we do that, we are actually embedded in each other's stories. We are embedded in each other's lives, and we are, more importantly, embedded in the ongoing, unfolding narrative of God's redemptive work through history. That's why Jesus is saying, I think, the first consideration is, this is not me, this is Jesus. I did not make this up. Unless you come as a child, or what I think is like a childlike posture, that I believe is imaginative, playful, and storing, you simply cannot and will not see the invisible, co-creating, unfolding story of God's kingdom on earth. You simply won't get into the kingdom because you won't even see the door. 2, the second thing Jesus is saying is we are actually adopted as children. I think what you're saying is you can't enter the kingdom unless you become a child, because it follows you cannot then be a child of God the Father. If you don't want to take on childlikeness, how can you be adopted by God the Father? So childlikeness and adoption kind of go together. Entering the kingdom as a child means we enter through imagination, this visible world, and redemptive work as God's adopted children. And fold 3, the third thing, and this is the one that I didn't actually come to me until very, very recently. I've spent most of my ministry life advocating from the bottom up, like fighting up for children and to find space in church and to fight for their rights and their place and their whatever, that they should have a stake in what's going on. But I missed the first part of this charge that Jesus says, that the kingdom actually belongs to children. The kingdom already is in possession in ownership, in occupancy of kids. The kingdom is made up of kids. Now, how can you say that? Either Jesus means this literally, that we are to somehow deconstruct our bodies and become children again, or he means something else. Well, we know when he's talking to Nicodemus, he says, you must be born again. And so I think it follows, unless you become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of God, which means that the people already in the kingdom are kids. That invisible door they've walked through, and the kingdom is occupied by a bunch of children, imaginative, co-creating, playful, storying people. Which follows, what I find so compelling about this, what I find so beautiful about this story and about these charges from Jesus, is that when we are imaginative, co-creating, storying individuals, and we become adopted into God's family as children, and we enter through that kingdom as kids, it means that we are all co-heirs, adopted heirs of the Father, which makes us all brothers and sisters. We are all adopted into his family as his kids, meaning we're all a family, all of us. And so the kingdom is actually a kingdom of kids, a family of children, a family of families that is imaginative, co-collaborating, co-creating, storying, participating, and equal. And so the values and the design and the outcome of our ministries and our churches, if the root of this, of these values, is family and it's childlikeness, what's really at the bedrock of the value of that? And it's really simple. The value driving all of this, I believe, is togetherness. It's love. It's love in togetherness. True equality, shared purpose across ages and stages and the spectrum and the cascade of ages and socioeconomic factors and demographics and races and creed. Shared purpose, shared meaning, a shared design, shared space, and shared outcomes. For our second breakout, now here I'm going to lay back again to the barriers. I've said a lot. I've dropped children a lot. I've dropped family a lot. I've dropped, I'm sure the adult in you is like, what are you talking about? The barriers that I've listed, maybe I've just been so vague, you don't understand any. That's the barrier of Amos getting in the way. It's a consideration of a paradigm shift. I'm not telling you I figured it out. This is what I feel compelling, what I believe, what's driven me. But lay aside the barriers. Try to get past them in conversation. And in your groups, be vulnerable, even if you hate them, Leah. How well does your church share the social space? How well do you share that space as a family? And how well does your church's design embody the values of family in terms of a kingdom of kids, a family of families? How well does your church share social space? And how well does your church's design embody the values of family? So Krista, I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right, Joel, just going to send us to our room to tackle those couple of questions. And then Amos, just so you know, a question came up in the chat. What role is there for leadership in this shared experience? So if you want to think about that and maybe address it briefly when we come back, if it fits with your talk, that'd be great.
Sweet. Well, I'm glad you all are, most of you are still here, hopefully in presence, not just bodies. The last thing that I want to do is share some insights, some personal insights, and around my experience with this. I began the call by saying I'm in deep grief over saying goodbye to my church family at Hanover Missionary for 9.5 years. And that's not an accident. I think in the church, we use the word church family, and it's kind of a lost and hollow phrase. And I want to try to recapture it, reinvigorate it, that in this sense, it really is a goodbye from that family. When I started kind of really leaning into this philosophy, this paradigm, as I shared, I've spent my entire ministry life fighting up as an advocate, but not always embracing. And when I embraced this view, this paradigm, and I allowed the value of togetherness to kind of influence my design, I saw very different outcomes in my ministry life. Actually, my life changed. My ministry changed. The things that I was a part of changed. And the physical and the social spaces that I was a part of, they changed. And the biggest one happened actually kind of pre-COVID in my last year and a half at Hanover Missionary, that we called the midweek meal. And I got to the point where leaning into these values of togetherness, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't feel like I was just a paid babysitter for other people's children. I felt increasingly uncomfortable with kind of the separation and the stratification of ages. I felt really uncomfortable with this drive for efficiency that we often have in the church, and this, which ends up ultimately being production, because efficiency is the main value. And I just felt uncomfortable. And so I actually dismantled my children's ministries. I dismantled my junior high ministries. I dismantled most of my family ministries. And I invited our congregation to participate in a generational meal on a Wednesday night. And it was simple. We came together, we ate together, hosted by chefs in our community from our church. We broke off into groups that were hosted by people who had passion. And then we came back at the end of the night for a bedtime story, all together, all of us. As practitioners and pastors, sometimes we make changes, we cast vision, we kind of, we in a sense, we have no idea how it's going to be accepted or rejected. And I felt really insecure. I had a lot of naysayers. A lot of people say this is the worst idea. I'm not coming. I don't want to sit at the table with my own kids. I don't want to sit at the table with people that I don't know. And on the first night, I was expecting about 60 people. That would have been a high for me. I would have felt good about deconstructing ministries and pivoting into a new ministry and launching it. 60 people would have been great. On our first night, we actually had 185 people registered. And it became, for me, every night I was learning from the experience. And I learned that in this kind of family of families approach, the less I saw people through the traditional lens, and the more I saw them as co-children, as my own brothers and sisters, the more human they became, and the more family they became. And this paradox happened, that their humanity, that their life stage actually became amplified, that I felt the gravity towards the elderly men in my church because they became my grandfathers. I felt gravity and a pull to the children, because they became like my nephews and nieces, and the youth and the middle age and the mothers. And the more I saw people as co-heirs, co-collaborators across the spectrum, the less I saw of what is traditionally separated us: age, stage, wealth, gender, creed, how much money we have in the bank. And it was a beautiful, beautiful formational experience. And every single night, this family of families experiences only was complete with everybody there. It wasn't the same without that individual or without that individual, because when it's a family, when people are missing, and you feel the loss of their presence. And so that was my own personal experience, that I've actually lived this. I've applied these values. This value of togetherness and love actually became the template for how I designed my ministry model. And the outcomes were that in 1 year, we didn't even get it to a year because COVID killed it. 1 year had more impact in that time than the 9 years or 8 years previous. And so the other part of this sneaky good news is This kind of reimagining that I'm presenting, this paradigm that I'm inviting you to consider, isn't me inventing anything at all. It's actually a returning. This is what we already are. If you are a child of God in his kingdom, you are already embedded and enmeshed in this family of families. That's what the whole thing is about. The invitation to be a part of God's family, to be an imaginative, co-collaborating, co-creator, storing participant in his unfolding work in the world. We are already children of God. We are already a family of families. So the invitation, the paradigm shift actually isn't that far, because a lot of what you're already doing is satisfying this. I'm just inviting you to consider a further reinvestment of those values. So the final thing I want to do with you tonight is to go back to that scene in that small village, back to that spot. And Jesus had just kind of chastised his disciples, and their faces, you could just imagine these grown men and young men and older men who thought they had such a high place with Christ. Their faces are forlorn, they're shamed. They've been schooled by Jesus. And Jesus blesses the kids, and he blesses the parents, and the scene kind of dissipates. But before you leave, you see something out of the corner of your eye, kind of a shimmering light. And it's coming out of from behind Jesus. And you can't quite make it out, but it's caught you enough that you're kind of walking towards it. And as you walk closer and closer, you see it's the shape of a rectangle. And without realizing it, you're actually quite close to it. And you see that it's a door. It's a nearly invisible door. And to your left and your right, you look, and while most of the crowd has left, there are others walking towards this invisible door with you. But the curious thing is that this door actually doesn't lead to anywhere. There's nothing behind it. There's no great big hall. It leads to nowhere. So your curiosity is very much engaged, and you move closer and closer to the door as your heart is kind of pounding out of its chest, and you can hear and feel breeze and light coming out of this door, and you pause and you look back at Jesus. What expression is he giving you? You take the final steps, you walk through the threshold, through the invisible door, and you're suddenly surrounded by throngs of people. And they're full of joy, and they're playing, and they're creating, and they're thinking, and there's works of art, and there's structures that are being made in this visible, invisible world. And it's a flurry of good, godly creativity, and it is all very, very good. And after a moment of kind of taking this in, you turn. The sun has set. And before you, you see that tall, dark wood. The woods are warmly lit with torches and fireflies. And in the distance, you hear the murmur of joyful conversation and the eruptions of laughter. And you walk towards the wood on this well-worn path of grass. You see that there's a clearing and a large feast laid out in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by tall, ancient trees and a huge ancient table, aglow with the lit of ornate chandeliers hanging over the boughs and the branches of this tree. And adorned on this table is a spread of food and color and drink, and the smells are rich and full. It is a feast. And then you take pause and you look up and down the table, and you see person after person after person, many of those who you just saw walk through the door, adorned in light, and a mother's there holding her infant child, and an elderly woman is sitting beside her laughing as she's reaching out to hold the babe herself. And across the table is a middle-aged man quietly in conversation with a younger man. You can't make out their conversation, but it's serious and contemplative. And sitting across from them is a small child, coloring on the tablecloth, drawing their favorite characters and scribbling away in their little scratch writing. And sitting across from them is a weathered-faced man, old, short, with white hair. He has an infectious smile. His face is old and worn and full of wisdom. and regret and hope, but he has a bellowing laugh. The kind of man that every time you see, he grabs your shoulder and gives you a hug. And he reaches across the table and he asks if he can color along with the boy. And the two engage in an intricate drawing of the Mandalorian, which the old man knows nothing about. Then a prayer is said. The food is passed. Everyone shares equally in the bounty of the feast. Everyone is heard. Everyone has place. And the master of the table looks up to you and invites you to come and sit and feast with your family of families. I asked you in the outset, what kind of church do you want to be a part of? Here's my answer. It's honest, it's raw, it's vulnerable. And I could land in some hot water. But the truth is, I actually don't want to be a part of a church. I want to be a part of a family. We've run out of time, so we're going to have one more breakout session. I don't think we have time for it. But my job for you, my task for you, my hope for you is that you've heard enough tonight to prayerfully consider. Just consider a shift in paradigm of values, of seeing the church as a family of families through childlikeness. And maybe, just maybe think about how that would change the design and the outcomes of your ministry life. And if you go back to that scene, who do you see at the table? And who is missing? Thank you for your time tonight.